The answer to that question is probably not. You ever wondered why Atari petered out in the mid 1990s? Well, in today's video, I'm going to talk a little bit about it. Let's get to it. As an Atari fan, I've oftentimes wondered what caused the decline of Atari by the mid 1990s. Why don't I see descendants of my beloved 520 ST today with a nice Fuji logo on them? And there are plenty of reasons why. I've read lots of hypotheses, theories, and those theories and hypotheses very likely are correct. Many of them probably are. But what I wanted to do is dive into numbers. And in this video, I'm going to go through the annual reports from Atari. This might be very boring to many of you. It might be interesting to some of you, but what I found in these annual reports were some pretty interesting things. There's some little nuggets as to leading us to why Atari failed, or some of the reasons why they failed by the mid 1990s. So let's get into it.
Atari was founded in 1972 by Nolan Bushnell and was an early driving force behind gaming and computing as we know it today. In its first few years of existence, it experienced a meteoric rate of growth, leading to many quotes as it being the fastest growing company in history at that point in time. During these early growth years, Atari was acquired by Warner Communications in 1976 for somewhere between $26 million and $28 million. And then Atari proceeded to grow so quickly, it became a massive part of Warner Communications' portfolio. In 1980 alone, we see that their revenues were somewhere between 900 million and 2.2 billion, depending upon the source you're looking at. But that was a massive, massive portion of Warner Communications' total income and revenue. In 1982, the movie Blade Runner was released. It depicted a 2019 that was a dystopian future with flying cars and the world run by mega corporations. One of these mega corporations, I assume based upon the depiction of the signage in the Blade Runner movie, was that of Atari. So the question is, with all this growth and all this potential at Atari, why did Atari not become the mega corporation ruling the world today, or one of the mega corporations ruling the world today? Much like we see Apple doing, which was its peer at the time. During this time, Atari was a de facto term, in the United States at least, for playing video games, right? Much like Kleenex or Q-tips. For my friends' parents or my parents, going to play video games was simply going to play Atari, regardless of whether it was a ColecoVision, a television, or some other system. In the early 1980s, the United States experienced a significant video game crash, and truly, Atari was likely a big cause of that, due to various different management practices and how it was being run. Now, this has been discussed at length, including lots of discussion about the burial of many cartridges in the desert. But what I'm going to focus on is the second life of Atari. After the crash, Atari was sold to Jack Tramiel. And during this time, there were meaningful successes at Atari, and perhaps even a small window where Atari could have remained relevant for the long term and been a driving force for home computing. It was a driving force for home computing at that point in time, but it obviously hasn't lasted, and it didn't last until today. To go over this, I'm going to focus specifically on Atari's annual reports, ranging from 1985 to 1993. Now, it could go a bit further, but by 1993, Atari was a shell of its former self. The end was summarized actually very well in Atari's 1995 annual report. Atari presently has a substantial unsold inventory of Jaguar and related products, and there can be no assurance that such inventory can be sold at current prices. By late 1995, Atari recognized that despite the significant commitment of financial resources that were devoted to the Jaguar and related products, it was unlikely that Jaguar would ever become a broadly accepted video game console, or that Jaguar technology would be broadly adopted by software title developers. As a result, Atari decided to significantly downsize its Jaguar operations. This downsizing resulted in significant reductions in Atari's workforce and significant curtailment of research and development and sales and marketing activities for Jaguar and related products. Accordingly, Atari decided to focus its efforts on selling its inventory of Jaguar and related products and to emphasize its existing licensing and development activities related to multimedia entertainment software for various platforms. The methodology I used was to leverage as many Atari financial reports that as I could find. And given that each financial report typically would show not just the current year, but the prior 2 years as well, I was able to cover all financials from 1985 to 1993 for Atari. Additionally, for comparison purposes, not necessarily to dive into any of the details, I also pulled together some financials from Commodore as well as from Apple during the same time. The intent is not to evaluate Commodore or Apple, but simply to use them as benchmarks when looking at various financials to define their relative size in terms of sales within the market, as well as other ratios of investment and such. Now, the metrics I specifically want to dig into from the annual reports are nothing special. They're relatively simple. Things such as net revenue or net sales, the cost of sales, R&D spend, marketing spend, gross income, operating income, net income. And individually, none of these are telling the entire story, but you pull them all together and they paint a picture of what was going on at Atari and the health at Atari. Now, another thing I really like about what Atari would also do is they also broke down a lot of these elements by the region around the world. And this also can tell us some interesting things about how Atari was competing geographically. Now, before diving into charts and graphs and numbers, I want to call out that Atari restated their earnings in 1987, or their 1987 earnings in their later annual reports. In the charting that I have coming up, I will be using the restated earnings. But at this point, I want to kind of go through why did they restate their earnings and tell a little story. In 1987, Atari had experienced a good 1986. This is a full year post the launch of their Atari ST line of computers, and they were looking for ways to amplify their position. They were already starting to do pretty well in Europe, but were not doing as well as they would have liked in North America in particular. So they went with buying a US consumer electronics chain of stores, the Federated Group. This included 67 stores in Kansas, California, Texas, and Arizona. Unfortunately, the Federated Group and their accountants had overvalued their assets by as much as $43 million. Additionally, these stores ended up operating at a loss during the subsequent year, this 1987, and along with an over $80 million loss when selling the Federated Group, Atari ended up with a total of $124 million in losses. On paper, this sounded like it might have been a good idea, and had the Federated Group been all it was cracked up to be, it might have actually been a win for Atari. However, the way it played out, those dollars that Atari spent and ended up losing could have been used in many different ways in order to bolster their position in a different fashion and hopefully achieve a much better result. This provides a little more context to some of the numbers you're going to see going forward. Let's start with the first metric, net sales. And what you can see here on the chart, it's pretty transparent as to what was going on. Atari experienced some decent growth in the first few years from 1985 to 1988. Unfortunately, that didn't last very long, and the sales started to taper off relatively quickly afterwards. And as you can see, in 1993, the end was there. Now, digging one layer deeper, we can take a look at how those sales varied by region. And this tells an interesting story and actually explains a little bit of why Atari wanted to go after the federated stores. If you look here, Europe was growing decently well and was a significant portion of the total sales, but North America just wasn't seeing any of the traction that Europe was. And had that federated stores purchase or something else similar in North America happened, the story could have turned around a little bit better. Would it have saved Atari? Maybe, maybe not. But this paints an interesting picture here. Now, just for a little bit of context, looking at adding Commodore to this chart. As you can see here, Commodore is about double the size of Atari. Even at Atari's peak in 1988, it was barely over half the size of Commodore from a sales perspective. Now let's add Apple for context. I can only get data for 1993 and 1992. There's plenty of stuff that I can find on Google, Googling and searching for what those revenues were for Apple in 1985, 1986, but the numbers never matched. So I decided, you know what, I'm not going to put them on a page. At, they are at least double what Atari and Commodore were combined in 1985, 1986, 1987. They were significantly higher. And as you look at them in 1992, 1993, Apple was massively larger. Again, just for context. Next, I'd like to talk about three different metrics here. First off, gross margin, followed by operating margin, and concluding with net margin. And we'll go through a little bit of the description as to what these exactly are. All right, what is gross margin? Well, it's effectively the price paid by the consumer less the cost to manufacture the good. In this case, we're showing an Atari ST. And what does this tell us? Well, this kind of tells us how our product cost is comparing to our product pricing and what we're getting in the marketplace. And that can tell us a little bit. Now, moving on to operating margin, or oftentimes called return on sales. This takes into consideration a few other costs, such as the cost to develop a product, R&D costs, the cost to market the product as well. We're still looking at the top line, the price paid by the consumer, or the revenue and sales, but we're adding those additional costs in the perspective because in order to continue to operate a business long term, you need to consider these metrics. And in this case here with Atari, this is probably one of the best metrics to consider. And now net margin or net profit, this takes into consideration all costs. This includes things such as mergers and acquisitions, interest expense or interest income, divestiture, sale of facilities, etc. And this is what effectively Atari would have been left with in their pocket at the end of the day. Now we start digging into looking at the gross operating and net margins. On the chart here, you see in the far left, in the darker blue color, you see the gross margin. The lighter blue is the operating margin, and the green is the net margin. And as you can see, from 1986 to 1988, they had some pretty decent years, specifically looking at the gross and operating margins. Now, if you look at 1988, the net margin is significantly negative, and that's in large part simply due to the write-off of the Federated Stores Group, the loss associated with that. If they hadn't had that, the margin would have actually been significantly better. Now, looking at 1989 onward, you take a look at both the gross margin and operating margin, you see some significant drops there. And what you can infer from the numbers is that revenues were going down, costs were about flat, maybe slightly up. And what that would suggest is that the unit sales were about the same, but pricing was going down. Pricing was taking a hit for a number of reasons. First off, the products were a bit outdated by that point in time. But in addition to that, the market was experiencing a significant slowdown in 1989 and a full on recession 1990 through 1991. The only reason 1990 ended up positive was due to a throwback of a reserve set aside for the Federated loss tied to the 1987 restatement. And then in 1991, you see a positive number there as well. That's because Atari sold off their Taiwan manufacturing facility for $40 million. Atari was already on the back foot due to the Federated loss. And then following that up with a market downturn into a recession was a 1-2 punch that really they weren't going to get away from. Now let's compare Commodore for context as well as a peer. I wasn't able to find 1990, 91, 92, or 93 annual reports for Commodore. If you have them or know where they're at, point them in my direction. I'd love to take a look at it and show a more complete story. But given what I had, you can take a look at both the gross and operating margins and how they compare versus each other. The blues are Atari, the greens are Commodore. And what you see is you see, at least during Atari's good years of 86 through 88, they were doing significantly better when you start looking, especially at operating margin, than Commodore was. Now we're adding Apple for context here again, similar to Commodore. The blues are still Atari, the greens are Apple at this point in time. And to be fair, I mean, we're comparing different time horizons. I would love to see Apple's data, actual financial reports from 86, 87, 88, thereabouts, when Atari was in its kind of doing well phase. So it actually compare how the margins compare versus each other. But this at least gives you a little bit of a taste, even if the timelines are relatively incomparable. Now, this next metric here is R&D as a percent of net sales. And I like to look at this to just give an idea as to how much of their sales dollars each of the businesses spending on developing new products and new capabilities as a whole. And just looking at Atari versus Commodore versus Apple, Atari was doing a decent job. Now, if we go back to the very first chart that we were showing of net sales, Atari's net sales were half of Commodore's. So even though the percentage looked pretty good, the absolute dollars were not the best. And then if you consider Atari's kind of schizophrenic nature on the products that they kept working on, whether it's Atari branded PCs or the Atari portfolio or any number of the various different side projects they were engaged in, those dollars would get frittered away relatively quickly. Now, you see a big spike in 1993 for R&D as a percent of sales. That's just simply because there were no sales. Another thing to consider is that if Atari had been able to grow their top line sales and maintain this R&D as a percentage of net sales, this would have helped them tremendously in order to kind of reinforce a virtuous cycle, providing better products to increase the top line sales, to be able to invest more money as a percentage of those sales in order to make more money as a business as a whole. Now, looking at marketing as a percentage of net sales, Atari was behind Commodore in the early years, and then it kind of flipped around in 1987, 1988 as a percentage of sales again. The absolute dollars, obviously, given that Commodore had significantly more sales, were significantly higher for Commodore. You know, thinking about if Commodore is about double the size of Atari, their marketing as a percentage of net sales was about double Atari's as well. Did this deliver what it needed to? Or could this have helped Atari? Maybe, maybe not. But they were in the realms of each other. Speaking of marketing, I'm not sure if Atari ever really did an assessment of their strengths versus their competition. They should go after, meaning going after Apple, going after the PC market. At a glance, my thought would be that their motto, power without the price, that was their niche in the home computer world. And now, while the ST was objectively powerful when launched, the shelf life of that power was relatively short and it waned quickly. Investing in keeping that price per unit of power in line with market progression could have possibly been one avenue Atari could have benefited and grown their top line. Now, that said, power without the price may not have actually been what drove customers to buy Atari. I don't know. I wasn't there at the time. I didn't talk to the marketers. However, it would have been interesting, or would be interesting, to see what modern marketing methods such as conjoint analysis could have done to inform Atari's strategic application of investment, investing in what their customers wanted and needed. Conjoint analysis used customer survey response and statistical methods to compare how one product and its features drive buying behavior versus other products and features.
All right, as a conclusion, could Atari have pulled it off? Well, based on what I've been seeing here, based on what I've been reading about how the company is run in general, and what I can infer from the various investments and ratios that I'm seeing here, or was seeing with Atari's successful years, I do think Atari had a chance. A slim one, but had a chance nonetheless.
How many did you see?
14,605,000. How many did we win? One.
The chances probably were not that slim, but really probably weren't that far off actually either. In order to be successful, Atari would have really had to get a significant growth in their top line. And the way they would do that is by taking share from Apple and from the PC compatible market. Or rather than not taking share, but growing at a rate faster than the PC and Apple were at that point in time, in the 1987 kind of time frame. This would have had to happen. The strategy would have had to be initiated no later than 1987, and starting to see results, real results, rapid real results, by 1988. Because in reality, if you actually look at where Apple and the PC compatible market was, they were an order of magnitude in size larger than Atari, even by this point. Atari had made some great strides, but they just weren't anywhere near the order of magnitude of where they needed to be from a competition standpoint to be able to last.
So what could Atari have done in order to help improve their chances? Well, first, Atari was doing decently well globally in 1986 through 1988. What they needed to do is they needed to grow faster. They were growing pretty rapidly in Europe, but at the same rate they were growing in Europe, they were losing sales in North America and the United States. They needed to do something to stem that tide. And the idea behind the Federated Stores purchase was not a bad idea. They wanted to grow sales in North America and the United States. The execution was wrong, it was off. So Atari would have had to, number one, either pick a different store to partner with and have that channel to sell their products. They had to come up with a different strategy where they could have incentivized distribution or different retailers with promotional dollars or whatnot in order to get their products placed in the United States in order to build that critical mass. All right, number two, with the establishment of better channels to get their product to market in North America, United States, as well as in Europe, Atari also needed to have better products to sell. They had a decent investment strategy, as we saw from the R&D ratios. They were investing a relatively decent amount of their funds into R&D and developing new products. They just weren't very focused. So Atari needed to focus more on what mattered most. And this goes back to my previous comment about understanding the niche in which they played, understanding where the market was, understanding the market they wanted to take, right? They had already won the specific market they were winning in, not tremendously, but they were winning something. They needed to better understand the market they were going after and how to develop a product to fit that market. There was too much scatter with the Atari PCs, the Atari portfolio, various different other chasing after different squirrels. And they needed to better focus their R&D approach. All right, the third and last element here, it seems a little trite, but Atari had to deliver hits. With that market space, with that ability to deliver and channel better sell to the market, with better products and investment strategies, Atari needed to deliver hits. They needed to execute on those strategies and deliver products to the marketplace that their customers wanted. And that delivered. Let's just take, for example, the power without the price. Atari delivered that initially, and the market responded. They did respond in the early 1980s. From 1986 through 1988, the market was responding to the Atari ST. They needed something next, and they needed it in 1988, or perhaps even late 87, to continue that development and show that Atari was invested in the future and the product line would continue to grow. Again, these items, even if Atari had successfully executed on it, they aren't a guarantee of success. Atari was a distant fifth place, really. You know, you had the PC world, you had Apple, you had Commodore. Actually, Atari was a distant fourth place. But they would have to do something in order to climb up that ladder relatively quickly. Was it possible? Was it impossible? No one will ever know, but these are just my thoughts here. I'm certain there are plenty of other folks who had other relevant information that would have said, hey, it would have been impossible to do this, what my suggestions are, or maybe they could provide additional insight. If you have additional insight, share it in the comments below. I appreciate you joining me on this little ride here. This has been actually really interesting for me, just to dive into the annual reports and look at the numbers and see what the numbers tell us. It is a story of a company, to be frank. I think it was relatively well run. When things were operating on full cylinders, 1986 through 1988, again, that's a relatively short window, 3 years, but the company was being operated well.
the margins that they were experiencing were actually pretty good and actually at par with the market and even better than some of their competitors. However, there were a couple missteps that really sank them. The Federated Store misstep, really, if you look at the loss associated with that, was almost unrecoverable. They made that mistake there with the Federated Store acquisition, following up with products that hadn't been updated properly, followed up with a market downturn, market slowing in 1989, and then a full-on recession. There was no way they were going to come out of that. Now, could they have lasted longer? If they'd made the right decisions, could they have made it to today? Maybe. That's a possibility. But I appreciate you for watching. Please comment below, like and subscribe if you liked it, and have a fantastic day. All the references of the various different annual reports, etc., they're in the, whatever you want to call it, the notes below. All right. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.